Lieutenant Commander Mike "Razor" Henderson banked his F-4 Phantom II hard left, scanning the skies over Hanoi through his canopy. Below him, the Red River snaked through North Vietnam like a brown scar. His radar operator called out a contact. Single bogey, 12 o'clock low, closing fast. Henderson squinted at the approaching aircraft. It looked like something from a museum. Stubby wings, simple lines, no sophistication whatsoever. A MiG-17, this antique shouldn't even be flying against modern American jets. "This'll be easy," Henderson muttered into his radio. The year was 1966, and American pilots owned the skies. They flew the most advanced fighters in the world, armed with heat-seeking missiles and sophisticated radar systems. The North Vietnamese were flying relics from Stalin's era. What happened next changed everything about air combat. The F-4 Phantom II was America's premier fighter jet, the crown jewel of military aviation. This beast could hit Mach 2.2, over 1,600 miles per hour, and climb faster than any fighter in the world. Its APQ-120 radar could spot enemy aircraft from 60 miles away, while its AIM-7 Sparrow missiles could kill from 20 miles out. The Phantom wasn't just fast, it was smart. Two-man crews meant one pilot could focus on flying while the radar intercept officer handled the sophisticated weapon systems. The Pentagon called it a missile truck, a flying platform designed to launch long-range missiles at enemies who'd never see it coming. Flying alongside the Phantoms were F-105 Thunder Chiefs, originally designed to deliver nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory. These massive single-seat fighters could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs while still maintaining supersonic speed. The Thud, as pilots called it, wasn't built for dogfighting. But it didn't matter. Dogfighting was dead. The cost difference told the whole story. Each F-4 Phantom cost the American taxpayer $2.4 million. The F-105 Thunder Chief ran about $2.1 million per aircraft. Meanwhile, intelligence reports estimated the North Vietnamese MiG-17 cost roughly $54,000 to build. You could buy 44 MiGs for the price of one Phantom. But money wasn't the point. Technology was everything. The Pentagon's missile doctrine dominated military thinking in the early 1960s. Air Force generals and Navy admirals agreed. The era of closed-in aerial combat was over. Modern jets would engage at long range with radar-guided missiles. Pilots would never see their enemies, never get close enough for a turning fight. The days of World War II dogfighting were finished. This philosophy shaped everything about American fighter design. The original F-4 Phantom didn't even carry an internal cannon. Why would it need one? Missiles were more accurate, more deadly, and could kill from distances that made guns irrelevant. Air Force Secretary Harold Brown summed up the thinking. The gun is as obsolete as the sword. American pilots entering Vietnam carried this confidence with them. They'd trained extensively on missile tactics, radar intercept procedures, and beyond visual range combat. Their aircraft represented the pinnacle of aerospace engineering. Their weapon systems were decades ahead of anything the enemy possessed. The North Vietnamese Air Force seemed like a joke. Intelligence briefings showed they flew outdated Soviet aircraft with primitive avionics and basic weapons. Most of their pilots had limited flight time compared to American aviators who'd logged thousands of hours in advanced trainers. When Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, American air commanders expected to establish immediate air superiority. The technological gap was simply too wide for the enemy to bridge. Modern American jets would sweep obsolete MiGs from the sky within weeks. F-4 squadrons deployed to Southeast Asia with supreme confidence. Their maintenance crews painted kill marks on aircraft before the first missions, anticipating easy victories. Pilots joked about target practice against museum pieces. The war in the air would be over before it really began. Squadron briefing rooms buzzed with excitement rather than concern. Pilots studied their sophisticated weapon systems and practiced missile engagement profiles. Nobody spent much time on close combat maneuvering or aerial gunnery. Why would they need those obsolete skills? The F-105 pilots shared this confidence. Their massive Thunder Chiefs could outrun anything the North Vietnamese possessed. If MiGs appeared, the Thuds would simply light their afterburners and escape at supersonic speed. The enemy couldn't touch American technology. Military planners in Washington celebrated before the first shots were fired. Classified Pentagon briefings predicted overwhelming American air superiority within the first month of operations. The missile-armed Phantoms and bomb-laden Thunder Chiefs would demonstrate the futility of challenging American aerospace supremacy. This wasn't arrogance. It was mathematical certainty. American jets were faster, more sophisticated, and better armed than anything in the North Vietnamese inventory. The technology gap was insurmountable. At least, that's what everyone believed. The MiG-17 first took flight in January 1950, when Harry Truman was president and the Korean War was just beginning. Soviet engineers had designed it as an improved version of the MiG-15, incorporating lessons learned from early jet combat over the Yalu River. By the time American Phantoms arrived in Vietnam, the MiG-17 was already 15 years old, ancient by aerospace standards. Everything about the MiG-17 screamed obsolete. Its single Klimov VK-1F turbojet engine could barely push the aircraft past 650 miles per hour, making it subsonic in an era when American jets routinely exceeded the speed of sound. The cockpit looked like something from World War II, with basic analog gauges and simple flight controls. No sophisticated radar, no computer-assisted weapon systems, no beyond visual range capability. The aircraft's armament seemed laughably primitive compared to American missile technology. Two 23mm cannons and one 37mm cannon. That was it. No heat-seeking missiles, no radar-guided Sparrows, just three old-fashioned guns that required pilots to get within a few hundred yards of their targets. In an age of 20-mile missile shots, the MiG-17 pilot had to see the whites of his enemy's eyes. But Soviet designers had built something American engineers had forgotten, a pure dogfighter. The MiG-17's construction was deliberately simple and rugged. It could operate from rough airfields with minimal ground support equipment. Its wide-track landing gear handled bumpy runways that would damage more sophisticated aircraft. Maintenance crews could service the engine with basic tools and limited spare parts. This wasn't advanced aerospace engineering. It was practical combat design. North Vietnamese pilots who flew the MiG-17 weren't the inexperienced rookies American intelligence reports suggested. Many had trained extensively in the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, logging hundreds of hours in advanced combat training programs. They'd studied American tactics, learned American weaknesses, and prepared specifically to fight the technological superiority of Western aircraft. The Vietnamese pilots understood their aircraft's limitations, but they also knew its strengths. The MiG-17 could turn inside any American fighter. Its simple construction meant fewer systems to malfunction under stress. The guns never ran out of ammunition the way missiles did, and they worked at any range once you got close enough. Soviet training doctrine emphasized close-in aerial combat, energy management, and aggressive maneuvering. Vietnamese pilots learned to fight in the vertical plane, using altitude and dive angles to compensate for their speed disadvantage. They practiced formation tactics that maximized their numerical advantages and minimized exposure to American missile attacks. American intelligence analysts looked at the MiG-17 specifications and dismissed it as a museum piece. The aircraft was slower, less sophisticated, and more primitive than anything in the American inventory. CIA briefings described North Vietnamese air defenses as minimal threat and technologically inferior. Military planners assumed the enemy would avoid air-to-air combat entirely. This assessment missed the fundamental reality of the MiG-17's design philosophy. Soviet engineers hadn't tried to build the most advanced fighter in the world. They'd built a weapon optimized for close combat against technologically superior enemies. Every design choice reflected this mission: tight turning radius, reliable guns, simple systems that worked under stress. The fatal underestimation was already taking shape in Pentagon briefing rooms and squadron ready rooms across the Pacific. American pilots studied their sophisticated weapon systems while dismissing their opponents as flying antiques. The technological gap seemed so wide that tactical preparation became almost irrelevant. But the North Vietnamese were preparing for a different kind of war. They knew they couldn't match American technology, so they'd focus on tactics, training, and exploiting the weaknesses of over-sophisticated systems. The MiG-17 wasn't advanced, it was focused. And that focus was about to expose the fatal flaws in American air combat doctrine. The stage was set for one of the most shocking reversals in military aviation history. The most advanced air force in the world was about to be humbled by pilots flying 15-year-old fighters with World War II-era guns. The obsolete MiG-17 was ready to teach American aviation a lesson it would never forget. March then in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that would define American air operations for the next 3 years. The mission was simple: use American air power to force North Vietnam to abandon its support for communist forces in South Vietnam. What seemed like a straightforward application of superior technology would become a nightmare that shattered every assumption about modern air combat. The first F-4 Phantom and F-105 Thunderchief missions launched from bases in Thailand and South Vietnam on March 2nd. Massive strike packages, sometimes over 100 aircraft, headed north toward targets around Hanoi and Haiphong. The formations included fighters, bombers, electronic warfare aircraft, and aerial refueling tankers. This was American air power at its most impressive, a technological symphony of destruction. But the rules of engagement immediately handcuffed American pilots in ways that would prove catastrophic. The Johnson administration, terrified of escalating the conflict into a wider war with China or the Soviet Union, imposed strict limitations on when and where American aircraft could engage enemy fighters. Pilots couldn't attack North Vietnamese airfields, couldn't pursue MiGs into Chinese airspace, and couldn't engage enemy aircraft unless they demonstrated hostile intent. These restrictions created a bizarre situation where American pilots had to wait for North Vietnamese fighters to attack first. The technological advantage of long-range radar and beyond visual range missiles became meaningless when pilots couldn't fire until the enemy was already close enough to threaten them. The rules turned every engagement into exactly the kind of close-in dogfight that American doctrine claimed was obsolete. Early encounters with North Vietnamese interceptors seemed to confirm American expectations. F-105 pilots reported easy intercepts against MiG-17s that appeared to flee whenever American fighters approached. Intelligence briefings described North Vietnamese pilots as reluctant to engage and tactically inferior. The enemy seemed to understand they were outmatched. Squadron intelligence officers showed pilots' gun camera footage of MiG-17s breaking off engagements and diving toward the deck. American pilots laughed at the primitive tactics. These weren't aerial combat maneuvers. They were panic reactions from pilots who knew they couldn't compete with modern American aircraft. F-4 crews reported multiple radar contacts that disappeared before missile engagement range. The North Vietnamese seemed to be using their MiGs primarily for reconnaissance, gathering intelligence on American formations rather than attempting actual combat. When MiGs did appear, they stayed at the edges of American formations, never closing to firing range. Pentagon briefings in Washington celebrated these early results as confirmation of American technological superiority. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara told Congress that North Vietnamese air defenses posed minimal threat to American operations. Air Force Chief of Staff General John McConnell predicted that sustained bombing would force North Vietnam to negotiate within 6 months. The arrogance reached its peak during spring 1965 briefings at Tactical Air Command headquarters. Senior officers studied strike mission reports that showed virtually no effective North Vietnamese air-to-air resistance. Enemy fighters appeared, American pilots maneuvered to engage, and the MiGs fled. The pattern repeated mission after mission. American pilots began treating North Vietnamese airspace like a training range. F-105 pilots focused on their primary mission, delivering bombs to ground targets while treating potential air-to-air threats as minor annoyances. F-4 crews practiced their beyond visual range intercept procedures, confident they'd never need close combat skills against such primitive opposition. The technological superiority seemed so overwhelming that some squadrons began requesting permission to reduce their air-to-air missile loads in favor of additional bombs or fuel. Why carry 4 AIM-7 Sparrows when the enemy refused to fight? The missiles were expensive, and the weight penalty reduced overall mission effectiveness. Squadron commanders encouraged this confidence. Pre-mission briefings spent more time on surface-to-air missile threats and anti-aircraft artillery than on enemy fighters. The MiG-17 appeared on threat charts as a minor concern, rated well below ground-based defenses in terms of mission risk. Pilot reports consistently described North Vietnamese tactics as defensive and evasive. Intelligence analysts interpreted this as evidence that enemy pilots understood their technological inferiority and were avoiding combat whenever possible. The assessment seemed logical. Why would obsolete fighters challenge the most advanced air force in the world? What nobody realized was that North Vietnamese pilots were studying American tactics, learning American weaknesses, and preparing for a different kind of war. Every evasive maneuver was actually reconnaissance. Every defensive reaction was tactical intelligence gathering. The enemy wasn't fleeing, they were learning. The North Vietnamese Air Force was about to graduate from flight school, and their first exam would be written in American blood. Captain Robinson Rissner pulled his F-105 Thunder Chief into a climbing turn over the Than Hoa Bridge, his massive fighter loaded with 750-pound bombs aimed at the strategic span crossing the Song Ma River. The bridge had become a symbol of North Vietnamese defiance. American pilots called it the Dragon's Jaw because it seemed to swallow bombs without taking significant damage. Reisner's radar warning receiver suddenly came alive with threat tones. His wingman's voice crackled over the radio. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high, coming down fast." 2 MiG-17s dove out of the sun, their silver shapes barely visible against the hazy sky. Reisner wasn't worried. His F-105 could outrun anything the North Vietnamese possessed. He'd simply light his afterburner and escape at supersonic speed, standard procedure when outnumbered by enemy fighters. But something went wrong with the textbook response. The lead MiG-17 didn't try to chase the fleeing Thunder Chief. Instead, it cut inside Rissner's turn, positioning itself for a deflection shot as the American pilot tried to escape. The North Vietnamese pilot had anticipated exactly what Reisner would do, and he'd prepared for it. Reisner found himself in a turning fight he never wanted, against an opponent he'd been told couldn't compete with American technology. The MiG-17 stayed glued to his tail through turn after turn, its tighter turning radius keeping it inside the F-105's flight path. Every time Reisner tried to extend the fight and use his speed advantage, the MiG pilot cut him off with precise maneuvering. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes, but it shattered 15 years of American air combat doctrine. The MiG-17's 37mm cannon opened fire at close range, its shells walking up toward Reisner's aircraft. The Thunder Chief shuddered as cannon rounds struck the fuselage and wing. Hydraulic fluid began streaming from damaged systems, and warning lights illuminated across Reisner's instrument panel. His sophisticated fighter was being torn apart by guns that belonged in a museum. Reisner managed to escape by diving toward the deck and using his aircraft's superior acceleration in a straight line. but his F-105 was badly damaged, leaking fuel and hydraulic fluid as he limped back toward base. The mission was a failure. The bombs never reached their target, and American technological superiority had been exposed as a myth. The after-action report landed on desks across the Pacific Command like a bombshell. An obsolete MiG-17 had not only engaged an F-105 Thunder Chief, but had nearly shot it down in a turning fight. The North Vietnamese pilot had demonstrated tactical skill, aggressive maneuvering, and precise gunnery that contradicted every intelligence assessment. Rissner's debrief revealed the shocking reality of close-in air combat. The F-105's sophisticated systems meant nothing once the fight moved inside visual range. His radar couldn't lock onto a maneuvering target at close range. His missiles couldn't track a fighter that stayed inside their minimum engagement envelope. His speed advantage disappeared in a turning fight where energy management and maneuvering skill determined the outcome. The MiG-17 pilot had forced the engagement into exactly the kind of combat where his aircraft's advantages mattered most. Simple, reliable guns that worked at any range. A tight, turning radius that could outmaneuver any American fighter. Rugged construction that could absorb battle damage and keep flying. Intelligence officers scrambled to reanalyze North Vietnamese pilot training and tactics. The evasive maneuvers they'd observed in previous encounters suddenly looked different. Those weren't panic reactions. They were tactical positioning moves designed to force American pilots into unfavorable engagements. The psychological impact on American pilots was immediate and devastating. If a single MiG-17 could nearly destroy an F-105 in combat, what would happen when North Vietnamese pilots started operating in larger numbers? The technological superiority that formed the foundation of American air combat doctrine had been revealed as an illusion. Squadron commanders tried to downplay the significance of the engagement. Official reports described it as a lucky shot by an unusually aggressive North Vietnamese pilot. The incident was classified to prevent damage to pilot morale and public confidence in American air power. But word spread through pilot ready rooms across Southeast Asia. Rissner was a respected combat veteran, not some rookie who'd made a tactical error. If he could be outmaneuvered by a MiG-17, any American pilot could find himself in the same situation. The first cracks appeared in the technological confidence that had dominated American military thinking since World War II. Advanced radar and sophisticated missiles meant nothing if the enemy could force you into a knife fight. The obsolete MiG-17 had just taught the U.S. Air Force its first lesson in humility. Military brass in Washington dismissed the engagement as an anomaly. They were wrong. April 3, 1965 marked the beginning of a 3-year education in the limitations of technology and the enduring importance of pilot skill, tactical thinking, and aircraft designed for close combat. The Dragon's Jaw had claimed its first victim, and it wasn't the bridge. The mathematics of aerial combat told a story that Pentagon analysts didn't want to hear. On paper, the F-4 Phantom II should have dominated any turning fight against a MiG-17. The Phantom weighed 58,000 pounds fully loaded compared to the MiG's 11,700 pounds. It produced 34,000 pounds of thrust from its twin J-79 engines, while the MiG's single engine generated just 7,500 pounds. Raw power-to-weight ratios favored American technology. But physics doesn't care about engineering pride or defense budgets. Turn radius calculations revealed the MiG-17's devastating advantage in close combat. At 350 knots, typical engagement speed for visual range dogfights, the MiG-17 could complete a full 360-degree turn in roughly 2,100 feet. The F-4 Phantom needed nearly 4,800 feet to complete the same maneuver. In a turning fight, the MiG pilot could literally fly circles around his American opponent. Wing loading explained why American technological superiority became a liability in dogfights. The F-4's wing loading, aircraft weight divided by wing area, measured 78 pounds per square foot. The MiG-17's wing loading was just 52 pounds per square foot. Lower wing loading meant the MiG could generate more lift per pound of aircraft weight, translating directly into tighter turns and better maneuverability. The Phantom's massive twin engines and sophisticated avionics became dead weight in a knife fight. All that advanced radar equipment, electronic countermeasures gear, and missile guidance systems added thousands of pounds without improving turning performance. The MiG-17's simple construction meant every pound contributed to combat effectiveness rather than technological sophistication. American missiles failed catastrophically in close combat scenarios. The AIM-7 Sparrow required a radar lock from the launching aircraft throughout the missile's entire flight time. In a turning fight, maintaining that lock became impossible as both aircraft maneuvered violently. The missile would lose guidance and self-destruct, leaving American pilots defenseless. Heat-seeking AIM-9 Sidewinders performed better in close combat, but they had their own limitations. Early versions couldn't distinguish between enemy aircraft and friendly fighters in a swirling dogfight. The missile's minimum engagement range meant it couldn't lock onto targets closer than 1,000 feet, exactly where MiG-17 pilots wanted to fight. The F-4's fatal flaw became apparent in every close engagement: no internal cannon. McDonnell Douglas engineers had eliminated guns from the original design because missiles were supposed to make them obsolete. When North Vietnamese pilots forced American fighters into gun range, the Phantoms had no weapons that could engage maneuvering targets at close range. MiG-17 pilots exploited this weakness ruthlessly. Their 37mm and 23mm cannons worked at any range once they got close enough. The guns never ran out of ammunition the way missiles did. They didn't require radar locks or electronic guidance systems that could malfunction under stress. Point the nose at the target, pull the trigger, and watch the shells tear through American aluminum. The engagement envelope told the whole story. American fighters dominated at long range, where their radar and missiles provided overwhelming advantages. But North Vietnamese pilots refused to fight at long range. They forced every engagement into the narrow band where their aircraft's advantages mattered most: visual range, high G maneuvering, and gun combat. Energy management became the decisive factor in determining combat outcomes. The MiG-17's lighter weight and lower wing loading meant it could maintain energy through tight turns that would bleed speed from heavier American fighters. F-4 pilots found themselves in a deadly spiral. Turn hard enough to track the MiG, and you'd lose speed until the enemy could outmaneuver you. Maintain speed, and the MiG would get behind you for a gunshot. American pilots were forced to play the MiG's game because the rules of engagement prevented them from using their technological advantages. They couldn't engage at beyond visual range because they had to identify targets before firing. They couldn't use their speed advantage to escape because the mission required them to stay and fight. Every engagement became exactly the kind of close-in dogfight that American doctrine claimed was obsolete. The physics of humiliation were simple and brutal. Sophisticated technology meant nothing if the enemy could force you into a fight where that technology became a liability. The MiG-17's primitive simplicity was actually advanced tactical design, every system optimized for close combat against technologically superior opponents. American air combat doctrine was about to collide with the immutable laws of physics, aerodynamics, and tactical reality. The obsolete MiG-17 wasn't just winning dogfights, it was proving that sometimes the most advanced solution is the wrong solution entirely. The morning of August 24, 1965 started like any other Rolling Thunder mission. 4 F-4 Phantoms from the 555th Fighter Squadron lifted off from Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, their sleek forms cutting through the humid Southeast Asian air. The target was a railroad yard near Hanoi, another attempt to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines flowing south. Major Frank Bennett led the formation, his radar intercept officers scanning the skies ahead for threats. Intelligence briefings had mentioned possible MiG activity, but Bennett wasn't concerned. His Phantoms carried the latest AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, and his pilots had trained extensively on beyond visual range intercept procedures. Any North Vietnamese fighters foolish enough to challenge them would be destroyed before they got close enough to matter. The formation crossed into North Vietnamese airspace at 25,000 feet, maintaining loose combat spread as they approached the target area. Bennett's RIO called out multiple radar contacts, climbing from airfields around Hanoi. 6 MiG-17s were vectoring toward the American formation, their primitive radars invisible to the Phantom's sophisticated detection systems. This was exactly the scenario American pilots had trained for. Multiple enemy fighters at medium range, perfect setup for radar-guided missile attacks. Bennett's formation would demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of modern air combat doctrine, but the North Vietnamese pilots had studied American tactics for months. They knew the F-4's strengths and weaknesses better than some American pilots did. Instead of presenting themselves as easy targets for long-range missile shots, the MiG-17s split into 3 pairs and approached from different directions, forcing the Phantoms to divide their attention. The lead MiG pair climbed aggressively toward Bennett's formation, while the other 4 aircraft positioned themselves for slashing attacks from the flanks. This wasn't the defensive, evasive maneuvering American intelligence had described. These were coordinated offensive tactics designed to neutralize American technological advantages. Bennett's RIO attempted to lock onto the lead MiGs with his APQ-120 radar, but the targets kept disappearing behind terrain features and reappearing at different altitudes. The North Vietnamese pilots were using the landscape to break radar locks, denying American missiles their primary advantage. The engagement exploded into chaos when the MiG-17s closed to visual range. Bennett found himself in a swirling dogfight with multiple enemy fighters, exactly the kind of combat his training had assured him would never happen. His sophisticated radar became useless as friend and foe mixed together in a deadly ballet of turning aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel James Kasler, flying Bennett's No. 3 position, watched in shock as MiG-17s turned inside his Phantom's flight path with impossible ease. Every time he tried to line up a missile shot, the enemy fighter would pull harder into the turn and disappear from his radar screen. The MiG's tighter turning radius made it nearly impossible to maintain a firing solution. The first American loss came when Captain William Norris found a MiG-17 glued to his 6 o'clock position. The North Vietnamese pilot had maneuvered behind Norris during a climbing turn, using superior maneuverability to gain a firing position. The MiG's 37mm cannon opened fire at close range, its shells punching through the Phantom's fuselage and severing hydraulic lines. Norris's F-4 began streaming fuel and hydraulic fluid as he desperately tried to escape. His radar intercept officer called out damage reports while Norris fought to maintain control of the crippled aircraft. The sophisticated fighter that had cost American taxpayers $2.4 million was being destroyed by guns that belonged in World War II. The MiG-17 pilot pressed his attack with ruthless efficiency. More cannon shells found their mark, destroying the Phantom's flight controls and setting the port engine on fire. Norris and his RIO ejected at 15,000 feet, their parachutes carrying them down toward captivity in North Vietnam. Bennett watched his wingman's aircraft explode and realized the fundamental assumptions of American air combat doctrine were catastrophically wrong. The obsolete MiG-17s weren't fleeing or avoiding combat. They were winning it. Their pilots demonstrated tactical skill, aggressive maneuvering, and precise gunnery that made American technological superiority irrelevant. The surviving Phantoms limped back to base with battle damage and shattered confidence. 3 F-4s had been engaged by 6 MiG-17s, and the Americans had lost 1 aircraft while scoring no kills. The exchange rate favored fighters that cost 50 times less than their American opponents. Pentagon briefing rooms fell silent when the after-action reports arrived. This wasn't a lucky shot or an isolated incident. It was systematic tactical defeat by supposedly inferior opponents. The The North Vietnamese had developed doctrine specifically designed to neutralize American advantages and exploit American weaknesses. The cover-up began immediately. Official reports classified the engagement details to prevent damage to pilot morale and public confidence. Media briefings continued to emphasize American air superiority while carefully omitting specific engagement results. But you can't hide the truth from the pilots who have to fly the missions. Word spread through squadron ready rooms across Southeast Asia. The MiG-17 wasn't obsolete, American tactics were. The technological myth was crumbling, and American pilots were paying the price in blood. Nguyen Van Bay adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon from the cockpit of his MiG-17. At 32 years old, he was already one of North Vietnam's most experienced fighter pilots, with over 800 hours of flight time and extensive training in the Soviet Union. American intelligence reports would later describe him as a poorly trained peasant pilot. But Bay had graduated from advanced combat schools that emphasized one thing above all else: how to kill technologically superior enemies. Bay wasn't alone in his expertise. The North Vietnamese People's Air Force had been quietly building a cadre of skilled pilots since the late 1950s. Many had trained at Soviet flight schools in Krasnodar and Armavir, logging hundreds of hours in advanced combat training programs. They'd studied American tactics, learned American weaknesses, and prepared specifically for the day when F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs would appear over their homeland. The home field advantage gave North Vietnamese pilots benefits that American commanders consistently underestimated. Every mountain, river, and valley below was familiar territory. They knew which terrain features could break American radar locks, which approach routes offered the best tactical positioning, and where to find cover when sophisticated missiles filled the sky. Ground-controlled intercept stations scattered across North Vietnam provided MiG pilots with real-time intelligence on American formations. Soviet-supplied radar systems tracked incoming strike packages from the moment. They crossed into North Vietnamese airspace, giving defenders precious minutes to position their fighters for optimal attacks. While American pilots relied on their own aircraft radar systems, North Vietnamese pilots had an entire network of ground stations feeding them tactical information. The Americans had fallen into predictable patterns that made the defenders' job easier. Strike packages typically approached targets from the same directions, flew at similar altitudes, and followed established ingress and egress routes. F-105 Thunder Chiefs loaded with bombs were particularly vulnerable. Their heavy ordnance loads reduced maneuverability and forced them to fly straight and level during bombing runs. North Vietnamese pilots exploited these patterns ruthlessly. They'd position their MiG-17s along known American flight paths, using terrain masking to avoid detection until the last possible moment. When American formations appeared, the MiGs would climb rapidly from low altitude, gaining the energy advantage needed for effective attacks. The psychological warfare element was just as important as tactical positioning. American pilots expected easy victories against primitive opponents, but the reality of being outmaneuvered by obsolete fighters shattered confidence and created doubt that affected performance in subsequent engagements. Every successful MiG attack reinforced the message that American technological superiority was an illusion. Bay and his fellow pilots developed aggressive tactics that maximized their aircraft's strengths while exploiting American weaknesses. They'd attack in pairs or larger formations, forcing F-4 pilots to split their attention between multiple threats. While one MiG drew American missiles and attention, others would maneuver for gun attacks from unexpected angles. The MiG-17's simple construction became a tactical advantage in the hands of skilled pilots. With fewer complex systems to manage, Vietnamese pilots could focus entirely on maneuvering and gunnery. Their aircraft didn't require sophisticated maintenance or perfect runway conditions. They could operate from rough airfields that would damage more advanced fighters. The David versus Goliath narrative that emerged from these early engagements wasn't just media propaganda, it reflected genuine tactical reality. North Vietnamese pilots were using skill, preparation, and intimate knowledge of their aircraft to defeat opponents who relied too heavily on technological advantages. American pilots began reporting encounters with MiG-17s that seemed to anticipate their every move. The North Vietnamese weren't just reacting to American tactics, they were dictating the terms of engagement, forcing sophisticated fighters into exactly the kind of close-in combat where obsolete aircraft could win. Intelligence analysts in Washington struggled to explain how pilots flying 15-year-old fighters were consistently outmaneuvering the most advanced air force in the world. The answer was simple, but difficult to accept. The North Vietnamese had better pilots flying aircraft better suited for the actual conditions of aerial combat over Vietnam. Bay would eventually be credited with 7 confirmed kills against American aircraft, making him one of North Vietnam's leading aces. But his individual success was part of a larger pattern that would force American aviation to confront uncomfortable truths about technology, tactics, and the enduring importance of pilot skill in aerial warfare. By early 1966, the statistical reality of air combat over North Vietnam painted a picture that Pentagon officials desperately wanted to hide. The numbers were brutal and undeniable. American fighters were losing the air-to-air war against aircraft they dismissed as museum pieces. The kill-to-loss ratio told the story in stark mathematical terms. Through the first year of Rolling Thunder operations, F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs had managed to shoot down just 14 North Vietnamese aircraft, while losing 27 of their own to enemy fighters. The exchange rate that was supposed to favor American technology by margins of 10-1 or better was running in the opposite direction. Individual engagements revealed the depth of the tactical disaster. On March 26, 1966, Major Paul Gilmore led a flight of 4 F-4 Phantoms on a strike mission against petroleum storage facilities near Haiphong. 6 MiG-17s intercepted the American formation, and what followed became a textbook example of how obsolete fighters could systematically destroy modern aircraft. The MiG pilots used coordinated tactics that split the Phantom formation and forced individual American aircraft into turning fights they couldn't win. Gilmore watched helplessly as his wingman's F-4 was shot down by 37mm cannon fire after being outmaneuvered in a vertical climb. The North Vietnamese pilot had anticipated the Phantom's escape attempt and positioned himself perfectly for the kill shot. 2 more Phantoms took battle damage severe enough to force emergency landings at Da Nang Air Base. Gilmore's own aircraft returned with cannon holes in the wing and fuselage. The mission was a complete failure. No bombs reached their targets, and American losses mounted while the enemy remained unscathed. Similar disasters repeated across North Vietnamese airspace throughout 1966. F-105 pilots reported being bounced by MiG-17s that appeared without warning, engaged aggressively, and disappeared before American reinforcements could respond. The Thunder Chief's massive size and heavy bomb loads made it particularly vulnerable to the nimble North Vietnamese fighters. Captain Leo Thorsness described one engagement where his F-105 Wild Weasel mission was attacked by 4 MiG-17s operating in coordinated pairs. The enemy fighters used vertical tactics to maintain energy while forcing the heavily loaded Thunder Chief into energy-depleting turns. Only superior acceleration in a straight line allowed Thorsness to escape, but his electronic warfare mission was compromised, and his aircraft sustained significant battle damage. American pilot morale began showing dangerous cracks as word of these defeats spread through squadron ready rooms. Pilots who'd entered combat confident in their technological superiority now faced the psychological reality that their sophisticated aircraft couldn't guarantee survival against determined enemies flying obsolete fighters. The human cost mounted with each mission. Captain Ronald Stortz's F-105 was shot down by a MiG-17 over the Red River Delta in April 1966. Stortz ejected successfully but was captured immediately and spent the next 7 years as a prisoner of war. His family received a telegram stating he was missing in action, with no mention that he'd been defeated by a fighter that wasn't supposed to pose a threat. Lieutenant Commander Dick Bellinger's F-4 fell victim to MiG-17s during a May 1966 escort mission. The North Vietnamese pilots had positioned themselves in the sun, using the classic World War II tactic of attacking from the enemy's blind spot. Bellinger's sophisticated radar never detected the approaching MiGs until cannon shells began tearing through his aircraft. Pentagon briefing rooms buzzed with classified discussions about the MiG problem that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara demanded explanations from Air Force leadership about why the most advanced fighters in the world were consistently losing to aircraft designed during the Truman administration. Internal Air Force studies revealed shocking deficiencies in pilot training and tactical doctrine. American pilots had spent thousands of hours learning to operate sophisticated radar and missile systems, but had virtually no experience in close combat maneuvering. When North Vietnamese fighters forced them into visual range dogfights, technological advantages became irrelevant and pilot skill determined outcomes. The missile reliability crisis compounded the tactical problems. AM-7 Sparrow missiles achieved kill probabilities of less than 10% in actual combat, far below the 90% success rates claimed during peacetime testing. Heat-seeking AIM-9 Sidewinders performed better, but still failed to achieve kills in over 60% of engagements where they were fired. Meanwhile, media reports continued to emphasize American air superiority while carefully avoiding specific engagement statistics. Press briefings featured footage of successful bombing missions and highlighted technological advantages without mentioning the mounting pilot casualties or tactical defeats. The institutional denial reached absurd levels when Air Force public relations officers began describing MiG-17 victories as lucky shots or isolated incidents, despite overwhelming evidence of systematic tactical superiority. The obsolete fighters weren't getting lucky. They were consistently outfighting the most advanced Air Force in the world through superior tactics, training, and aircraft designed for the actual conditions of aerial combat. By late 1966, the technological myth that had dominated American military thinking since World War II was crumbling under the weight of battlefield reality. The desperation was palpable in squadron maintenance hangars across Southeast Asia by late 1966. F-4 Phantom crews were demanding modifications that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. They wanted guns, old-fashioned World War II-style cannons that could engage maneuvering targets at close range. The missile-only doctrine that had seemed so advanced was now getting American pilots killed. McDonnell Douglas engineers scrambled to develop external gun pod solutions for the F-4 Phantom. The SUU-16A gun pod contained a single M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon with 1-200 rounds of ammunition. Mounted on the aircraft's centerline pylon, the pod promised to give Phantom crews the close-range firepower they desperately needed against agile MiG-17s. But the gun pod solution created as many problems as it solved. The external mounting disrupted the F-4's carefully designed aerodynamics, reducing maximum speed and maneuverability. The added weight and drag meant Phantoms carrying gun pods couldn't match their original performance specifications. Ironic, since they were trying to improve combat effectiveness against more maneuverable opponents. Captain Steve Ritchie was among the first F-4 pilots to fly combat missions with the gun pod installation. His initial enthusiasm quickly turned to frustration as he discovered the system's fundamental limitations. The external cannon vibrated violently when fired, making accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The gun's fixed mounting meant pilots had to point the entire aircraft at their target, exactly what MiG-17 pilots were trained to prevent. Maintenance crews struggled with the gun pod's reliability issues. The M61 cannon jammed frequently in combat conditions, leaving pilots with a useless weight penalty that made their aircraft more vulnerable to enemy fighters. Ammunition feed systems malfunctioned regularly, and the external mounting exposed delicate firing mechanisms to combat damage and environmental stress. The weight penalty proved catastrophic in actual dogfights. F-4s carrying gun pods lost critical performance in the vertical maneuvering, where they might have maintained advantages over MiG-17s. The additional 800 pounds of gun pod and ammunition reduced climb rate, increased turn radius, and degraded acceleration, all factors that played directly into North Vietnamese tactical advantages. Pilot training gaps became apparent as American aviators tried to master aerial gunnery skills they'd never learned. The Air Force had eliminated gun training from fighter pilot curricula in the early 1960s, confident that missiles had made such primitive skills obsolete. Now pilots were trying to learn World War II gunnery techniques while flying combat missions against experienced enemies. Lieutenant Colonel Robin Olds, commanding the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon, watched his pilots struggle with gun pod installations and recognized the deeper problem. The F-4 wasn't designed for close-in dogfighting, and no amount of external modifications could change its fundamental characteristics. Adding guns to a missile truck was like putting a sword on a tank, theoretically possible but practically ineffective. The psychological impact on pilot morale was devastating. American aviators had been told they flew the most advanced fighters in the world, only to discover they needed World War II-era weapons to survive against obsolete opponents. The gun pods represented institutional admission that 15 years of aerospace advancement had produced aircraft less capable than their predecessors in actual combat. Worse, the gun pod solution highlighted the fundamental mismatch between American aircraft design and combat reality. The F-4 had been optimized for beyond visual range intercepts against Soviet bombers, not close-in dogfights against maneuverable fighters. Every design choice, from the aircraft's size and weight to its radar and missile systems, reflected missions that bore no resemblance to aerial combat over North Vietnam. North Vietnamese pilots quickly adapted their tactics to exploit the gun pod's limitations. They'd force F-4s into turning fights where the external cannon's fixed mounting became a liability rather than an asset. MiG-17 pilots could outmaneuver Phantoms trying to line up gunshots, then attack with their own cannons from positions where the American aircraft couldn't respond effectively. The desperation measures weren't limited to gun pods. Some F-4 crews began carrying fewer missiles to reduce weight, hoping improved maneuverability would compensate for reduced firepower. Others experimented with different missile combinations, trying to find the optimal balance between long-range and short-range weapons for the close-in combat they never expected to fight. Squadron commanders found themselves in an impossible position. They could acknowledge the gun pod's limitations and leave their pilots defenseless in close combat, or they could accept the performance penalties and hope external cannons would provide some advantage against MiG-17s. Either choice meant sending pilots into combat with aircraft fundamentally unsuited for the missions they were actually flying. The gunfighter's dilemma exposed the bankruptcy of American air combat doctrine in the starkest possible terms. By late 1966, the Air Force needed a hero, and they found one in Colonel Robin Olds. At 44 years old, Olds was already a legend, a World War II ace with 12 confirmed kills, who transitioned from P-51 Mustangs to F-4 Phantoms without losing his killer instinct. When he took command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, he brought something American pilots desperately needed, a plan to beat the MiGs at their own game. Olds studied the tactical disasters of 1965 and 1966 with the analytical mind of a chess master. He recognized that North Vietnamese pilots had been dictating the terms of engagement, forcing American fighters into close combat scenarios where technological advantages became liabilities. The solution wasn't better technology, it was better tactics. The colonel's plan was audacious in its simplicity: trick the North Vietnamese into fighting on American terms. Operation Bolo would use deception to lure MiG-21s, the newer, more dangerous North Vietnamese fighters, into a trap where F-4 Phantoms could use their missile advantages effectively. The deception required meticulous planning and perfect execution. Olds would disguise his F-4 Phantoms as F-105 Thunderchief strike packages, mimicking everything from radio frequencies to flight profiles. North Vietnamese ground controllers would see what appeared to be vulnerable bomb-laden thuds heading toward targets near Hanoi. When MiG-21s scrambled to intercept the easy targets, they'd find themselves facing missile-armed Phantoms in a carefully orchestrated ambush. Every detail mattered. F-4 pilots practiced flying at the same altitudes and airspeeds typically used by F-105 formations. Radio operators used Thunderchief call signs and communication procedures. Electronic warfare aircraft jammed North Vietnamese radar systems at precisely the right moments to maintain the illusion without revealing the trap. The mission required split-second timing across multiple aircraft formations. Olds would lead the primary strike package of F-4s disguised as bomb-laden F-105s. Additional Phantom flights would position themselves as backup interceptors, ready to engage any MiGs that escaped the initial trap. Aerial refueling tankers would orbit at predetermined locations to ensure American fighters could maintain station long enough to spring the ambush. January 7th, 1967 dawned clear and cold over North Vietnam. Olds led 14 F-4 Phantoms north toward the Phuc Yen airfield complex, his formation maintaining perfect discipline as they mimicked F-105 strike tactics. North Vietnamese radar operators watched the approaching Thunderchiefs and scrambled MiG-21s to intercept what appeared to be another routine bombing mission. The trap worked perfectly. 7 MiG-21s climbed rapidly toward Olds' formation, their pilots confident they were engaging heavily loaded strike aircraft that couldn't maneuver effectively in air-to-air combat. The North Vietnamese had no idea they were flying directly into the guns of America's most experienced fighter pilots. Olds called "bandits in sight" as the MiG-21s approached his formation. The colonel's wingman, Captain Ralph Wetterhahn, immediately locked onto the lead North Vietnamese fighter with his APQ-120 radar. The AIM-7 Sparrow missile fired at optimal range, exactly the beyond visual range engagement American doctrine had been designed for. The first MiG-21 exploded in a brilliant fireball as the Sparrow's warhead detonated. Olds maneuvered his F-4 for a shot at the second enemy fighter, his radar intercept officer calling out range and bearing information. Another Sparrow launch, another kill. The North Vietnamese pilot suddenly realized they'd been deceived, but it was too late to escape. The aerial battle lasted less than 15 minutes, but the results were devastating for North Vietnamese air defenses. 7 MiG-21s were shot down without a single American loss. Olds personally accounted for 1 kill, while his wingmen and supporting flights destroyed the remaining enemy aircraft. The technological superiority that had seemed mythical for 2 years suddenly became brutally real. The psychological impact of Operation Bolo extended far beyond the kill count. American pilots finally had proof that their aircraft and weapons could dominate enemy fighters when used properly. The key was forcing engagements at ranges where sophisticated radar and missiles provided decisive advantages rather than allowing North Vietnamese pilots to dictate close-in dogfights. But Olds understood that Bolo was a temporary victory rather than a permanent solution. The operation had succeeded against MiG-21s, but MiG-17s remained a persistent threat. Their pilots were too experienced to fall for the same deception twice, and their aircraft were still perfectly suited for the close combat scenarios that American doctrine struggled to handle. The colonel's success demonstrated that tactical innovation could overcome technological limitations, but it also highlighted the deeper problems plaguing American air combat doctrine. One brilliant operation couldn't solve the fundamental mismatch between aircraft designed for one type of warfare and the actual conditions of aerial combat over Vietnam. Operation Bolo bought time and restored confidence. But the war against obsolete fighters flying superior tactics was far from over. Captain James Stockdale felt his F-4 Phantom shudder as 37mm cannon shells from a MiG-17 tore through the aircraft's starboard wing. Warning lights flashed across his instrument panel as hydraulic fluid streamed from ruptured lines. His radar intercept officer called out damage reports while Stockdale fought to maintain control of the crippled fighter. But the North Vietnamese pilot wasn't finished with his attack. The MiG-17 stayed glued to Stockdale's tail through a series of desperate evasive maneuvers, its pilot demonstrating the kind of aggressive persistence that American intelligence had insisted didn't exist among poorly trained peasant aviators. More cannon fire found its mark, severing critical flight controls and setting the port engine ablaze. At 8,000 feet over the Red River Delta, Stockdale made the decision that would define the next 7 years of his life. "We're punching out," he told his backseater over the intercom. 2 ejection seats fired in sequence, launching both men into the humid Vietnamese air as their $2.4 million fighter disintegrated below them. Stockdale's parachute carried him down toward a landscape that would become intimately familiar and brutally hostile. The capture came within minutes of touchdown. North Vietnamese militia surrounded Stockdale before he could even gather his parachute, their faces showing none of the fear or respect that American propaganda had promised would greet captured airmen. These weren't intimidated peasants cowering before American technological superiority. They were confident defenders who'd just watched one of their obsolete fighters destroy the most advanced aircraft in the world. Stockdale joined a growing population of American airmen whose technological arrogance had been answered with imprisonment in facilities that would become infamous. The Hoa Lo prison in Hanoi, nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by its unwilling guests, housed dozens of pilots who'd been shot down by aircraft they'd been told couldn't compete with modern fighters. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Risner arrived at Hoa Lo after his F-105 Thunderchief was destroyed by a MiG-17 during a strike mission over the Than Hoa Bridge. Risner had been one of America's most experienced combat pilots, a veteran of World War II and Korea who'd accumulated thousands of flight hours in advanced aircraft. None of that experience had prepared him for the tactical reality of fighting MiG-17s flown by pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities better than American intelligence understood American weaknesses. The human cost of technological hubris became personal for families across America as telegrams arrived with devastating news. Mrs. Sarah Henderson received word that her husband Mike was missing in action over North Vietnam, with no details about how his advanced F-4 Phantom had been outmaneuvered and destroyed by a fighter designed when Harry Truman was president. The official notification made no mention of tactical failures or doctrinal mistakes, just the sterile language of military bureaucracy hiding uncomfortable truths. Captain William Lawrence's wife learned of his capture through a Red Cross message that arrived 6 months after his F-4 was shot down by MiG-17s over Hanoi. Lawrence had ejected successfully but sustained serious injuries during his parachute descent. North Vietnamese forces provided minimal medical care, viewing captured American pilots not as prisoners of war deserving humane treatment, but as war criminals who'd been bombing civilian targets. The psychological warfare began immediately upon arrival at the Hanoi Hilton. North Vietnamese interrogators used the tactical defeats as leverage against captured pilots, pointing out that obsolete fighters had consistently outfought the most advanced air force in the world. How could American pilots claim technological superiority when they were sitting in prison cells after being shot down by museum pieces? Major Fred Cherry endured months of torture and isolation after his F-105 was destroyed by a MiG-17 during a wild weasel mission. Cherry's sophisticated electronic warfare aircraft, designed specifically to suppress enemy air defenses, had been helpless against a simple fighter using basic tactics and reliable guns. The irony wasn't lost on his captors, who used it as evidence of American military incompetence. The media back home continued reporting American air superiority while carefully avoiding specific statistics about pilot losses or tactical defeats. Families of captured airmen received sanitized accounts that emphasized heroic sacrifice while omitting the uncomfortable reality that their loved ones had been outfought by supposedly inferior opponents. Inside the Hanoi Hilton, captured pilots shared stories that painted a devastating picture of American tactical failures. They'd been trained to fight one kind of war, beyond visual range intercepts against Soviet bombers, but found themselves in close combat dogfights against maneuverable fighters flown by skilled, aggressive pilots who'd studied American weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. The personal stakes of the MiG-17's success weren't measured in aircraft losses or strategic objectives. They were measured in human lives, American pilots who'd believed in their technological superiority until North Vietnamese fighters proved that superior tactics could triumph over advanced technology. These men would spend years as prisoners, living proof that the obsolete MiG-17 had won more than just aerial battles. By March 1967, the technological myth that had sustained American air power doctrine for over a decade was collapsing under the relentless pressure of battlefield reality. The skies over North Vietnam had become a killing field, where obsolete fighters consistently outmaneuvered the most advanced aircraft in the world, and American pilots were dying because their leaders refused to acknowledge the scope of the tactical disaster. The escalation was brutal and undeniable. MiG-17 squadrons that had once operated cautiously were now hunting American formations with predatory aggression. North Vietnamese pilots had learned that F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunderchiefs weren't invincible technological marvels. They were expensive targets with exploitable weaknesses. The psychological balance had shifted completely. American pilots approached North Vietnamese airspace with growing dread, while their enemies climbed toward combat with increasing confidence. Major James Kasler led a strike package of 8 F-105 Thunderchiefs toward a bridge complex near Tay Nguyen on March 22, 1967. His formation loaded with 750-pound bombs and external fuel tanks that turned the fighters into flying anvils. Intelligence briefings had warned of increased MiG activity, but Kasler's pilots carried the same overconfidence that had gotten so many of their colleagues killed or captured. The attack came without warning. 12 MiG-17s dove out of the sun in coordinated pairs, their silver shapes barely visible against the hazy sky until cannon fire began tearing through American aluminum. The North Vietnamese pilots had positioned themselves perfectly, using terrain masking and precise timing to achieve complete tactical surprise against a formation that should have detected them miles away. Kasler watched helplessly as his No. 3 aircraft exploded under concentrated 37mm fire. Captain Robert Abbott's F-105 disintegrated in a brilliant fireball that scattered burning debris across the jungle canopy below. There was no ejection, no parachute, just the instant transformation of a $2.1 million fighter and its pilot into smoking wreckage. The surviving Thunderchiefs jettisoned their bomb loads and fled toward the relative safety of South Vietnamese airspace. But the MiG-17s pursued them relentlessly. These weren't the defensive, evasive tactics American intelligence had described. The North Vietnamese pilots were pressing their attacks with the kind of sustained aggression that characterized air superiority fighters, not obsolete defensive interceptors. Lieutenant Colonel William Jones felt cannon shells punch through his F-105's wing as he desperately tried to outrun a MiG-17 that had maneuvered behind him during the initial attack. The Thunderchief's superior straight-line speed meant nothing when the enemy pilot could anticipate every escape attempt and position himself for deflection shots. Jones's sophisticated fighter was being hunted by a museum piece flown by a pilot who understood aerial combat better than American doctrine writers. The Thud Ridge runs, F-105 strike missions along the mountainous terrain northwest of Hanoi, had become suicide missions that consumed aircraft and pilots at unsustainable rates. The ridge's narrow valleys channeled American formations into predictable flight paths where MiG-17s waited in ambush. What had once been considered a relatively safe ingress route had become a killing ground where North Vietnamese fighters destroyed heavily loaded strike aircraft with methodical efficiency. Captain Leo Thorsness described the psychological horror of flying these missions. Every time we approached the ridge, we knew the MiGs were waiting. We could see them on radar, climbing from their airfields, positioning themselves for attacks we couldn't prevent. Our sophisticated aircraft became death traps once the enemy forced us into close combat. The pilot rotation system that was supposed to maintain combat effectiveness had become a mechanism for spreading tactical defeat across the entire Air Force fighter community. Experienced pilots who'd survived tours in Southeast Asia returned to training commands in the United States, where they tried to prepare new pilots for combat realities that contradicted everything in official doctrine manuals. Young pilots arriving in theater discovered that their advanced training was worse than useless. It was actively dangerous. They'd spent hundreds of hours learning to operate sophisticated radar and missile systems, but had never practiced the close combat maneuvering skills they needed to survive against MiG-17s. The institutional knowledge gap was killing American pilots faster than enemy action. The technological myth was finally cracking under pressure from field commanders who could no longer ignore the mounting casualties. Internal Air Force studies began acknowledging what squadron pilots had known for months. American fighters were losing the air-to-air war against aircraft that shouldn't have posed a threat to modern military aviation. Pentagon officials faced an impossible choice: acknowledge the tactical failures publicly and undermine confidence in American military technology, or continue the institutional denial while pilots died in combat against supposedly inferior opponents. The bureaucratic instinct for self-preservation won, ensuring that the lessons written in American blood would take years to reach the training programs that might have prevented future disasters. The breaking point had arrived, but institutional momentum would carry the failed doctrine forward for months more. The classified report that landed on Air Force Chief of Staff General John McConnell's desk in June 1967 contained numbers that shattered 2 decades of military aviation orthodoxy. The document, stamped "secret" in bold red letters, represented the first honest institutional assessment of American air combat performance over North Vietnam. What it revealed was a tactical disaster of unprecedented proportions. The statistics were brutal and undeniable. Through the first 2 years of Rolling Thunder operations, American fighters had achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of 2.2 to 1 against North Vietnamese aircraft, barely better than breaking even. Against MiG-17 specifically, the numbers were even worse. The obsolete fighters had shot down more American aircraft than they'd lost, turning the technological superiority myth into a statistical nightmare. Internal Air Force studies revealed shocking deficiencies that contradicted every assumption about modern air combat. The ALT report, commissioned by the Navy to analyze air-to-air combat effectiveness, painted a devastating picture of institutional failure. American pilots were losing dogfights not because their aircraft were inferior, but because their training was fundamentally wrong for the war they were actually fighting. Captain Frank Alt's investigation team interviewed hundreds of combat pilots and analyzed every air-to-air engagement over North Vietnam. Their findings demolished the missile-only doctrine that had dominated American military thinking since the late 1950s. Sophisticated, radar-guided missiles achieved kill probabilities of less than 10% in actual combat, far below the 90% success rates claimed during peacetime testing. The training deficiencies were even more damaging than the equipment failures. American pilots had spent thousands of hours learning to operate complex radar and missile systems, but had virtually no experience in the close combat maneuvering that determined outcomes in actual dogfights. When North Vietnamese fighters forced them into visual range combat, technological advantages became irrelevant and pilot skill determined who lived or died. Missile reliability issues exposed the fundamental flaws in American air combat doctrine. AIM-7 Sparrow missiles required continuous radar illumination from the launching aircraft throughout their flight time. In a turning dogfight, maintaining that radar lock became impossible as both fighters maneuvered violently. The missile would lose guidance and self-destruct, leaving American pilots defenseless against enemies armed with reliable guns. Heat-seeking AIM-9 Sidewinders performed better than radar-guided missiles, but they had their own limitations in close combat. Early versions couldn't distinguish between enemy aircraft and friendly fighters in confused dogfights. The missile's minimum engagement range meant it couldn't lock onto targets closer than 1,000 feet, exactly where skilled MiG-17 pilots wanted to fight. The Fighter Mafia, a group of Air Force officers who'd argued for maintaining close combat capabilities throughout the missile revolution, found themselves vindicated by battlefield results they'd rather not have been right about. Colonel John Boyd, Major John Riccioni, and other tactical reformers had warned that sophisticated technology couldn't replace fundamental flying skills in aircraft designed for maneuvering combat. Boyd's energy maneuverability theory, dismissed by Pentagon officials as outdated thinking, proved prophetic in the skies over Vietnam. His mathematical analysis of aircraft performance in turning fights explained exactly why MiG-17s were outfighting F-4 Phantoms despite massive technological disadvantages. The obsolete fighters had been optimized for the kind of combat that actually occurred, while American aircraft had been designed for theoretical engagements that rarely happened. The institutional reckoning forced uncomfortable admissions from senior military leaders who'd staked their careers on technological solutions to tactical problems. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, architect of the systems analysis approach that had eliminated guns from fighter aircraft, quietly ordered studies of air combat training reforms and aircraft modifications that would restore close combat capabilities. Calls for fundamental doctrine changes began emerging from combat units and training commands. Squadron commanders who'd watched their pilots die in dogfights against obsolete opponents demanded immediate reforms to pilot training curricula and aircraft design priorities. The technological hubris that had characterized American military aviation since World War II was finally confronting the reality of aerial combat. The most painful admission was the simplest. The MiG-17 had never been obsolete. American intelligence analysts had mistaken technological simplicity for tactical inferiority, failing to recognize that the North Vietnamese flew aircraft perfectly suited for the actual conditions of air combat over Southeast Asia. The enemy had been flying superior fighters all along, superior for the mission they were designed to perform. The C-130 transport aircraft touched down at Groom Lake, Nevada in the pre-dawn darkness of September 1967. Its cargo bay containing the most valuable intelligence prize of the Vietnam War. Inside the stripped-down fuselage sat a complete MiG-17F Fresco, its silver skin gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the classified facility that would later become famous as Area 51. The aircraft had been acquired through a secret CIA operation that involved bribes, defections, and months of delicate negotiations with sources throughout Southeast Asia. American intelligence agencies had finally realized they needed to understand their enemy's capabilities through direct evaluation rather than theoretical analysis based on outdated assumptions. Project Have Drill represented a fundamental shift in American military thinking. For the first time since World War II, the United States was systematically studying enemy aircraft to understand why American pilots were losing dogfights against supposedly inferior opponents. The program would reveal truths that shattered decades of technological arrogance. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Collins, a veteran test pilot with over 3,000 hours in fighter aircraft, climbed into the MiG-17's cockpit for the first American evaluation flight. What he discovered during the next 45 minutes of flight testing contradicted every intelligence assessment about North Vietnamese fighter capabilities. The MiG-17 wasn't the primitive, underpowered aircraft that American analysts had described. Its Klimov VK-1F engine provided excellent throttle response and reliable performance throughout the flight envelope. The aircraft's simple construction translated into predictable handling characteristics that allowed pilots to focus on tactics rather than aircraft management. Collins marveled at the fighter's turning performance as he put it through a series of combat maneuvers. The MiG-17 could sustain 6.5 G turns at combat weight without losing energy, maintaining turning performance that no American fighter could match. In a sustained turning fight, the obsolete MiG would literally fly circles around an F-4 Phantom. The aircraft's gun armament proved devastatingly effective in close-range engagements. The 37mm cannon packed enough punch to destroy any American fighter with a single well-placed burst, while the twin 23mm guns provided high rates of fire for tracking shots against maneuvering targets. The weapons were simple, reliable, and perfectly suited for visual range combat. More shocking discoveries emerged as American test pilots pushed the MiG-17 through its complete performance envelope. The aircraft's roll rate exceeded that of the F-4 Phantom at combat speeds. Its instantaneous turn rate allowed rapid direction changes that could defeat missile tracking systems. The vertical performance, while inferior to American fighters in pure climb rate, was optimized for the energy management tactics that North Vietnamese pilots employed so effectively. Captain Chuck Yeager, the legendary test pilot, flew the captured MiG-17 and immediately understood why American pilots were dying over North Vietnam. "This isn't a primitive aircraft," he reported to Pentagon officials. "It's a purpose-built dogfighter that's better at close combat than anything we've got." The MiG-17's actual performance envelope revealed why North Vietnamese pilots consistently forced American fighters into turning fights. The aircraft's design characteristics made it nearly impossible to defeat in sustained maneuvering combat. American pilots flying heavier, less maneuverable fighters were doomed the moment they accepted a turning engagement. Classified test results from Groom Lake painted a devastating picture of American tactical disadvantages. The MiG-17 could outturn, outroll, and outgun any fighter in the American inventory once the engagement moved to visual range. The technological superiority that Pentagon officials had assumed was actually technological inferiority disguised by sophisticated marketing. Additional MiG-21s acquired through similar intelligence operations revealed that even North Vietnam's modern fighters were optimized for close combat rather than beyond visual range intercepts. The enemy had built an entire air force around aircraft designed to exploit American weaknesses that American commanders didn't even know existed. The psychological impact on American test pilots was profound. These were experienced aviators who'd flown every fighter in the American inventory, and they were consistently outperformed by aircraft they'd been told were obsolete. The enemy hadn't just been flying competitive fighters, they'd been flying superior fighters for the specific mission of air-to-air combat over North Vietnam. Project Have Drill's classified findings reached Pentagon officials just as the ALT report was documenting the scope of American tactical failures. The combination of honest battlefield assessment and direct enemy aircraft evaluation created an undeniable picture. American air combat doctrine was fundamentally wrong, and American pilots were paying the price with their lives. The captured MiG-17 had taught American aviation its most important lesson of the Vietnam War. The enemy was better than anyone had imagined. The desperation had reached breaking point by late 1967. McDonnell Douglas engineers worked around the clock at their St. Louis facility, redesigning the F-4 Phantom from the inside out. The aircraft that had been hailed as the pinnacle of aerospace engineering was about to receive the most primitive modification imaginable: an internal cannon. The F-4E Phantom program represented institutional admission that 15 years of technological advancement had produced a fighter less capable than World War II aircraft in actual combat. The new variant would carry an M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon in its nose, replacing sophisticated radar equipment with a weapon that belonged in a museum according to the missile-only doctrine that had dominated American military thinking. General Dynamics engineers faced unprecedented challenges integrating the 6-barrel Vulcan cannon into the Phantom's crowded nose section. The weapon system weighed 1,400 pounds, loaded with 640 rounds of ammunition, requiring extensive structural modifications to accommodate the gun's violent recoil forces. Every component had to be redesigned around the reality that close combat weapons were essential for survival against obsolete opponents. The M61 Vulcan represented a return to World War II fundamentals wrapped in modern engineering. The cannon fired 6,000 rounds per minute, 100 shells per second, creating a devastating stream of 20mm projectiles that could destroy any fighter aircraft with a brief trigger pull. Unlike sophisticated missiles that required perfect conditions to function, the gun worked every time the pilot pulled the trigger. Captain Steve Ritchie was among the first pilots to fly the F-4E in combat over North Vietnam. His initial engagement with a MiG-17 demonstrated the psychological transformation that occurred when American pilots finally had weapons suited for close combat. Instead of fleeing when the enemy fighter forced a turning fight, Ritchie could maneuver aggressively and engage with confidence that his aircraft carried effective close-range armament. The gun's installation required fundamental changes to F-4 tactics and training. Pilots who'd spent years learning sophisticated missile employment procedures now had to master aerial gunnery techniques that their predecessors had used over Germany and the Pacific. The Air Force hastily established gun training programs that taught modern pilots skills their grandfathers had considered basic fighter pilot knowledge. Major John Pardo described the cultural shock of returning to gun combat. "We'd been told that missiles made dogfighting obsolete, that sophisticated technology had eliminated the need for primitive weapons. Then, we found ourselves learning to compute lead angles and deflection shots like World War II pilots. The humiliation was complete. New tactics development focused on energy management and positioning for gun attacks rather than beyond visual range missile employment. Pilots learned to use the F-4's superior acceleration and climb rate to gain advantageous positions for gun passes, then disengage before MiG-17s could force sustained turning fights that favored the more maneuverable enemy aircraft. The psychological impact extended beyond individual pilots to the entire Air Force fighter community. Squadron ready rooms that had once buzzed with discussions of sophisticated radar modes and missile engagement envelopes now featured World War II gunnery training films and deflection shooting exercises. The technological revolution had come full circle. Pilot retraining programs revealed the depth of institutional knowledge that had been lost during the missile-only era. Senior pilots who'd flown gun-armed fighters in Korea became valuable instructors, teaching young aviators skills that had been considered obsolete just years earlier. The Air Force was literally relearning how to fight air-to-air combat. The F-4E's combat debut in late 1967 marked a turning point in American air-to-air effectiveness over North Vietnam. Pilots finally had weapons that could engage maneuvering targets at close range, eliminating the helplessness that had characterized so many previous encounters with MiG-17s. The psychological balance began shifting as American aviators regained confidence in their ability to win dogfights. But the gun's installation also highlighted the fundamental design compromises that had made the modification necessary. The F-4E was still a large, heavy fighter optimized for beyond visual range intercepts. Adding a cannon improved its close combat capabilities without changing its basic characteristics or eliminating the maneuvering advantages that made MiG-17s so dangerous in turning fights. The return to World War II fundamentals represented more than tactical adaptation. It was philosophical revolution. American military aviation had to confront the uncomfortable reality that sophisticated technology couldn't replace fundamental combat effectiveness. The pendulum was swinging back toward balanced fighter design that emphasized both advanced systems and basic fighting capability. Technology would serve tactics rather than replacing them entirely. The humble cannon had humbled the missile-only doctrine. The message that arrived at Miramar Naval Air Station in March 1969 was brief and classified. Establish Advanced Fighter Weapons School immediately. Priority Alpha. Captain Frank Ault, author of the devastating report that had exposed American air combat failures, was tasked with creating something that had never existed in modern military aviation, a graduate-level program for teaching pilots how to win dogfights. The Navy Fighter Weapons School represented institutional admission that decades of technological advancement had failed to produce pilots capable of defeating obsolete opponents. The most advanced Air Force in the world needed to learn basic aerial combat from the ground up, starting with fundamentals that World War II pilots had considered elementary knowledge. Miramar's sprawling complex of hangars and runways would become the laboratory where American military aviation confronted its failures and rebuilt its tactical foundation. The base's location in Southern California provided year-round flying weather and airspace restrictions that allowed realistic combat training without civilian interference. This would be where the lessons written in American blood over North Vietnam would finally be transformed into institutional knowledge. The school's mission was unprecedented in its scope and urgency. Selected pilots would spend 5 weeks learning to fight air-to-air combat against aircraft specifically designed to replicate enemy tactics and capabilities. The curriculum would emphasize energy management, tactical positioning, and aggressive maneuvering, skills that had been eliminated from pilot training programs during the missile-only era. Commander Dan Peterson, chosen as the school's first commanding officer, faced the daunting task of creating effective training programs without official doctrine or institutional support. The Navy had no manual for teaching dogfighting, because official doctrine claimed dogfighting was obsolete. Peterson and his instructors would have to develop their curriculum from combat reports, pilot interviews, and hard-won experience over Southeast Asia. The selection process for both instructors and students reflected the program's elite status. Only the Navy's most experienced and skilled pilots would be chosen to attend or teach at the new school. These weren't average aviators. They were the top 1% of naval aviation, pilots whose skill and experience might allow them to survive the kind of close combat scenarios that had proven fatal for so many of their colleagues. The aircraft chosen for adversary training revealed how completely American thinking had changed. Douglas A-4 Skyhawks would play the role of MiG-17s, their small size and excellent maneuverability providing realistic simulation of North Vietnamese fighter capabilities. The Skyhawks weren't sophisticated or advanced. They were simple, reliable aircraft perfectly suited for the kind of maneuvering combat that determined outcomes in actual dogfights. Lieutenant Commander John Nash, one of the school's first instructors, described the psychological transformation required. We had to forget everything we'd been taught about modern air combat and start over with World War II fundamentals: turn radius, energy management, deflection shooting. These weren't obsolete skills, they were survival skills. The training philosophy emphasized humility over technological arrogance. Student pilots would be systematically defeated by instructors flying less sophisticated aircraft, demonstrating that pilot skill and tactical knowledge mattered more than advanced technology. The lessons were painful but necessary. American pilots had to learn that sophisticated equipment couldn't compensate for fundamental tactical ignorance. Dissimilar air combat training became the school's core methodology. Students would face opponents flying different aircraft types with different performance characteristics, forcing them to adapt their tactics to specific threat capabilities rather than relying on generic procedures. This was exactly the kind of tactical flexibility that North Vietnamese pilots had demonstrated so effectively against American formations. The MiG-17 became the primary adversary model for all training scenarios. Instructors studied captured aircraft performance data from Project Have Drill, incorporating actual enemy capabilities into realistic training profiles. American pilots would finally learn to fight the aircraft that had been killing them, understanding its strengths and weaknesses through direct experience rather than theoretical analysis. The graduate-level designation wasn't marketing hyperbole. It reflected the program's unprecedented depth and sophistication. Students would study threat aircraft characteristics, enemy tactics, and weapons employment in detail that exceeded most engineering programs. They'd learn to think like their enemies, understanding the tactical logic behind maneuvers that had seemed mysterious or primitive. The psychological impact on participating pilots was profound and immediate. Aviators who'd entered the program confident in their technological superiority left with deep respect for enemy capabilities and realistic understanding of their own limitations. The arrogance that had characterized American military aviation was being systematically eliminated through controlled defeat in realistic training scenarios. Top Gun's establishment marked the end of the missile-only era and the beginning of balanced fighter pilot training that emphasized both technological capability and fundamental combat skills. The school would produce a new generation of pilots who understood that winning dogfights required more than advanced aircraft. It required tactical knowledge, aggressive maneuvering, and respect for enemy capabilities. The obsolete MiG-17 had forced American aviation to rediscover the forgotten arts of aerial combat. The briefing room at Miramar fell silent as Commander Dan Peterson stepped to the podium, his weathered face bearing the scars of a pilot who'd learned hard lessons over North Vietnam. Behind him, a large screen displayed the silhouette of a MiG-17, the aircraft that had become the unwitting professor in American aviation's most painful education. "Gentlemen," Peterson began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional failure, "you're here because everything we thought we knew about air combat was wrong. The enemy has been teaching us lessons written in American blood, and it's time we started learning." The Top Gun curriculum was built on a foundation of humility that contradicted decades of American military thinking. Students weren't taught that their aircraft were superior. They were shown exactly why technological advantages meant nothing against skilled opponents flying aircraft designed for the mission they were actually performing. Energy management became the school's fundamental doctrine, replacing the missile-only philosophy that had gotten so many pilots killed. Students learned to think of their aircraft as energy systems rather than weapons platforms, understanding how altitude, airspeed, and maneuvering affected their ability to survive and win in close combat. This was physics applied to aerial warfare, the same principles that MiG-17 pilots had been using to defeat American fighters for years. Lieutenant Randy Duke Cunningham was among the first class of Top Gun students, his previous combat experience over North Vietnam having taught him the deadly consequences of tactical ignorance. During his first training flight against an A-4 Skyhawk, simulating a MiG-17, Cunningham discovered that his F-4 Phantom's technological sophistication became a liability once the fight moved to close range. The A-4 instructor, Commander John "Yank" Tarver, systematically destroyed Cunningham's confidence in American technological superiority. The small, simple Skyhawk could turn inside the Phantom's flight path with ease, positioning itself for gunshots that would have been fatal in actual combat. Cunningham's sophisticated radar and missile systems meant nothing when his opponent stayed inside visual range and forced a turning fight. "The MiG-17 pilot doesn't care about your advanced avionics," Tarver explained during the post-flight debrief. "He knows his aircraft can outturn yours, outroll yours, and outgun yours once he gets close enough. Your job is to prevent him from dictating the terms of engagement." Threat aircraft characteristics study consumed hours of classroom time as students learned to think like their enemies. The MiG-17's performance envelope became as familiar as their own aircraft's capabilities. Students memorized turn rates, climb performance, and weapon specifications not to demonstrate academic knowledge, but to survive encounters with pilots who'd been using these characteristics to kill American aviators. The MiG-17 emerged as the primary adversary model for all training scenarios because it represented the perfect synthesis of simplicity and effectiveness. Unlike more advanced fighters that relied on sophisticated systems, the MiG-17's design philosophy emphasized fundamental combat capability over technological complexity. Every design choice served the single purpose of winning close-range dogfights. Air combat maneuvering fundamentals replaced the beyond visual range intercept procedures that had dominated pilot training for over a decade. Students learned to fight in the vertical plane, using altitude and dive angles to gain tactical advantages. They practiced defensive maneuvers designed to defeat gun attacks and offensive positioning for their own weapons employment. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical education. Pilots who'd entered Top Gun with supreme confidence in American technological superiority left with deep respect for enemy capabilities and realistic understanding of their own limitations. The arrogance that had characterized American military aviation was being systematically eliminated through controlled defeat in realistic training scenarios. Commander Mike "Viper" Metcalf, one of the school's senior instructors, described the philosophical revolution. "We're not teaching these pilots to fly better aircraft. We're teaching them to be better pilots." The MiG-17 proved that pilot skill matters more than advanced technology when the fight gets close and personal. The new generation of fighter pilots emerging from Top Gun carried lessons that their predecessors had learned too late. They understood that winning dogfights required tactical knowledge, aggressive maneuvering, and most importantly, respect for opponents flying aircraft perfectly suited for close combat. The technological hubris that had cost so many lives was being replaced with tactical realism based on battlefield experience rather than theoretical assumptions. The curriculum of humility was producing pilots who could finally match the tactical sophistication that North Vietnamese aviators had demonstrated from the beginning of the air war over Southeast Asia. The morning of May 10, 1972, marked the beginning of Operation Linebacker, President Nixon's renewed bombing campaign against North Vietnam that would test everything American aviation had learned from 7 years of tactical disasters. Lieutenant Randy Duke Cunningham climbed into his F-4 Phantom at Miramar Naval Air Station. But this wasn't the same pilot who'd entered combat over North Vietnam in 1967. This was a Top Gun graduate, trained in the forgotten arts of aerial combat that had cost so many American lives. Cunningham's radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Willie Irish Driscoll, ran through their pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of aviators who understood that survival depended on preparation rather than technological superiority. Their F-4J carried the internal M61 cannon that had become standard equipment after years of bitter experience with missile-only armament. The gun represented institutional admission that World War II weapons were still essential for modern air combat. The North Vietnamese Air Force that rose to meet the renewed American bombing campaign was dramatically different from the tentative defenders of 1965. 7 years of combat had transformed them into one of the world's most experienced fighter forces. Their MiG-17 pilots had accumulated thousands of hours of combat time against the most advanced aircraft in the American inventory, learning lessons that no peacetime training could provide. But American pilots had learned lessons too. Cunningham's approach to the target area reflected Top Gun training that emphasized tactical flexibility over rigid procedures. He scanned the skies with the systematic discipline of a pilot who understood that MiG-17s could appear from any direction, using terrain masking and coordinated tactics to achieve surprise against even the most alert formations. The engagement began when Driscoll's radar detected multiple contacts climbing from Kep Airfield northeast of Hanoi. 8 MiG-17s were vectoring toward the American strike package, their pilots confident after years of successful combat against sophisticated opponents. This would be the ultimate test of whether American aviation had truly learned from its tactical disasters. Cunningham immediately recognized the enemy formation's aggressive positioning. These weren't the defensive intercepts that American intelligence had described in early war briefings. The MiG-17s were hunting, using coordinated tactics designed to split American formations and force individual aircraft into the kind of close combat where obsolete fighters could exploit their maneuvering advantages. The first engagement demonstrated how completely the tactical balance had shifted. When a MiG-17 attempted to force Cunningham into a turning fight, the Top Gun graduate refused to accept the enemy's terms of engagement. Instead of turning hard and bleeding energy in a futile attempt to outmaneuver the more agile opponent, Cunningham used vertical tactics to maintain his energy advantage while positioning for a missile shot. The AIM-9 Sidewinder that destroyed the first MiG-17 represented more than just improved weapons technology. It demonstrated tactical knowledge that American pilots had purchased with blood over 7 years of combat. Cunningham had learned to fight the enemy's aircraft rather than fighting the way his own aircraft's designers had intended. The psychological transformation was complete when Cunningham engaged his second MiG-17 of the day. Instead of the technological arrogance that had characterized early American encounters with North Vietnamese fighters, he approached the engagement with professional respect for an opponent flying an aircraft perfectly suited for close combat. The enemy pilot was skilled, experienced, and dangerous, but no longer mysterious or invincible. The training was paying dividends across the entire American fighter force. Top Gun graduates were sharing their knowledge with squadron mates, spreading tactical lessons that had been learned through controlled defeat in realistic training scenarios. The institutional knowledge that had been lost during the missile-only era was finally being rebuilt through systematic education rather than battlefield disasters. MiG-17s remained dangerous opponents throughout the final years of American involvement in Southeast Asia, but they were no longer the tactical masters of North Vietnamese airspace. American pilots had learned to fight the war they were actually in rather than the war their doctrine writers had imagined. The technological balance hadn't shifted. The tactical balance had been restored through hard-won knowledge and respect for enemy capabilities. The lessons learned through blood and sacrifice were finally producing the tactical competence that should have existed from the beginning. The MiG-17 that American pilots had dismissed as a laughingstock in 1965 would ultimately reshape fighter aircraft design for the next 50 years. By the time the last American combat missions flew over Southeast Asia, the obsolete Soviet fighter had taught the world's most advanced Air Force lessons that would influence every subsequent generation of military aircraft. The General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon, which first flew in 1974, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of hard-won knowledge purchased with American blood over North Vietnam. The aircraft's designers had studied every engagement between F-4 Phantoms and MiG-17s, incorporating lessons about maneuverability, pilot visibility, and close combat effectiveness that contradicted decades of technological orthodoxy. Colonel John Boyd's energy maneuverability theory, vindicated by battlefield results over Southeast Asia, became the foundation for F-16 design philosophy. The new fighter emphasized sustained turning performance and instantaneous maneuverability over raw speed and sophisticated avionics. This was the MiG-17's design philosophy applied to modern American aerospace engineering: simplicity and combat effectiveness over technological complexity. The F-16's bubble canopy provided pilots with unprecedented visibility, addressing one of the critical disadvantages that had cost American lives in dogfights against more maneuverable opponents. MiG-17 pilots had consistently used superior visibility and situational awareness to achieve tactical surprise against F-4 crews whose sophisticated radar systems couldn't detect close-range threats effectively. McDonnell Douglas engineers incorporated similar lessons into the F/A-18 Hornet design, creating a fighter that balanced advanced technology with fundamental combat capability. The aircraft's twin-engine configuration and excellent low-speed handling characteristics reflected institutional memory of engagements where technological sophistication had proven less important than basic flying qualities and pilot skill. The modern, beyond visual range versus dogfighting debate that continues to dominate fighter aircraft development traces its origins directly to the tactical disasters over North Vietnam. Every contemporary discussion about air-to-air combat doctrine references the lessons learned when obsolete MiG-17s systematically outfought the most advanced fighters in the world through superior tactics and pilot training. The MiG-17's influence extended far beyond American aircraft design. Soviet engineers studied the combat reports from North Vietnam and incorporated similar design philosophies into subsequent fighter generations. The emphasis on close combat maneuverability and reliable weapon systems became standard throughout Warsaw Pact air forces, creating a generation of fighters optimized for the kind of tactical scenarios where the MiG-17 had proven so devastatingly effective. Red flag exercises at Nellis Air Force Base institutionalized the lessons that American pilots had learned through 7 years of tactical defeats. The massive training programs, which continue today, emphasize realistic threat simulation and dissimilar air combat training, direct descendants of the Top Gun curriculum that emerged from institutional recognition of American tactical failures. Modern aggressor squadrons fly aircraft specifically chosen to replicate the performance characteristics and tactical capabilities that made the MiG-17 so dangerous. F-5 Tigers and F-16s painted in enemy camouflage schemes served the same role that captured MiG-17s played in Project Have Drill, teaching American pilots to respect enemy capabilities rather than dismissing them based on technological assumptions. The psychological transformation that began with the MiG-17's tactical victories continues to influence pilot training and aircraft development. Military aviation no longer assumes that technological superiority guarantees tactical success. Every new fighter program must demonstrate effectiveness in close combat scenarios that the missile-only doctrine claimed were obsolete. Technology balanced with tactical reality became the new paradigm for American fighter development. Advanced radar systems and sophisticated missiles remained important capabilities, but they were integrated with internal cannons, excellent maneuverability, and pilot training that emphasized fundamental combat skills alongside technological proficiency. The humble fighter's lasting victory wasn't measured in aircraft destroyed or battles won. It was measured in institutional knowledge that prevented future tactical disasters. The MiG-17 had forced American aviation to confront the dangerous myth that advanced technology could replace tactical competence and pilot skill. Modern stealth fighters like the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning incorporate lessons learned from every engagement between American aircraft and North Vietnamese MiG-17s. Their design philosophies reflect hard-won understanding that winning air-to-air combat requires balanced capabilities rather than technological specialization that ignores fundamental combat requirements. The laughingstock had taught the world's most advanced air force that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the wrong solution entirely. The final accounting of American losses to MiG-17s over North Vietnam reads like a corporate balance sheet written in blood. Between 1965 and 1973, obsolete fighters that cost $54,000 each shot down American aircraft worth over $200 million. The exchange rate that Pentagon planners had expected to favor advanced technology by margins of 10 to 1 instead ran heavily against the world's most sophisticated air force. The human cost couldn't be measured in dollars or procurement budgets. Captain James Stockdale spent 7 years in North Vietnamese prison camps after his F-4 Phantom was destroyed by a MiG-17's cannons. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Rissner endured torture and isolation at the Hanoi Hilton, his F-105 Thunder Chief reduced to smoking wreckage by guns that belonged in a museum, according to American doctrine writers. Major Fred Cherry's career ended in a North Vietnamese prison cell after his sophisticated electronic warfare aircraft was outmaneuvered and destroyed by a simple fighter using basic tactics. The irony wasn't lost on his captors, who used his defeat as propaganda evidence that American technological superiority was an illusion created by defense contractors and Pentagon bureaucrats. The families affected by technological hubris received telegrams that offered no explanation for how the most advanced military in history had been consistently outfought by supposedly primitive opponents. Mrs. Sarah Henderson learned that her husband Mike was missing in action over North Vietnam, with no mention that his $2.4 million fighter had been destroyed by an aircraft that American intelligence had dismissed as obsolete. The institutional learning curve's human cost extended beyond individual tragedies to encompass an entire generation of military aviators whose careers were shaped by tactical disasters that should never have occurred. Young pilots arriving in Southeast Asia discovered that their advanced training was worse than useless. It was actively dangerous in the combat environment they actually faced. Captain Leo Thorsness described the psychological horror of flying missions, where technological advantages became liabilities. We'd been told our aircraft were invincible, that our missiles could kill at ranges where the enemy couldn't touch us. Then, we found ourselves in knife fights, with museum pieces flown by pilots who understood aerial combat better than our doctrine writers. The broader lessons for military procurement emerged slowly as defense analysts studied the tactical disasters over North Vietnam. The missile-only doctrine that had eliminated guns from fighter aircraft represented institutional thinking that prioritized theoretical capabilities over battlefield requirements. Advanced technology had been pursued for its own sake rather than its contribution to actual combat effectiveness. Respecting enemy capabilities became the painful lesson that American military aviation had to learn through defeat rather than analysis. Intelligence assessments that dismissed the MiG-17 as obsolete reflected dangerous assumptions about the relationship between technological sophistication and tactical effectiveness. The enemy had been flying superior aircraft all along, superior for the mission they were designed to perform. The Pentagon systems analysis approach, championed by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, had produced aircraft optimized for statistical performance rather than combat reality. The F-4 Phantom's impressive specifications, Mach 2.2 speed, sophisticated radar, beyond visual range missiles, meant nothing when North Vietnamese pilots forced engagements into close combat scenarios where those advantages became irrelevant. Why the obsolete MiG-17 won came down to fundamental design philosophy rather than technological advancement. Soviet engineers had built a fighter optimized for the kind of aerial combat that actually occurred, while American designers had created aircraft for theoretical engagements that rarely happened. The enemy understood the mission better than the Americans understood their own requirements. The arrogance that had characterized American military thinking since World War II was finally confronted by battlefield results that couldn't be explained away through bureaucratic denial or public relations campaigns. The most advanced air force in the world had been systematically outfought by pilots flying 15-year-old fighters with World War II-era guns. The price of that arrogance was measured in more than aircraft losses or strategic failures. It was measured in human lives, shattered careers, and institutional trauma that would take decades to overcome. The technological myth that had dominated American military procurement had been exposed as dangerous fantasy that got pilots killed and missions failed. The MiG-17's victory over American arrogance was complete and undeniable. The obsolete fighter had taught the world's most advanced military that sophisticated technology couldn't replace tactical competence, pilot skill, or aircraft designed for the actual conditions of combat rather than the theoretical scenarios preferred by defense planners and doctrine writers. The MiG-17's ultimate victory wasn't measured in aircraft destroyed or battles won. It was measured in the institutional transformation it forced upon American military aviation. This obsolete fighter had accomplished something no Soviet propaganda campaign could achieve. It made the United States Air Force admit its fundamental assumptions about modern warfare were catastrophically wrong. Top Gun continues its mission today at Fallon Naval Air Station, where modern pilots still learn the lessons that North Vietnamese MiG-17 pilots taught through 7 years of tactical dominance over supposedly superior opponents. Every dogfighting technique, every energy management principle, every aspect of threat assessment traces back to knowledge purchased with American blood over the skies of Southeast Asia. The fighter that changed everything proves that sometimes the most advanced solution is the wrong solution entirely. Subscribe for more untold stories of military aviation's greatest lessons.